Welcome to the Church Growth Interviews podcast for Missional Marketing. I'm Bart Blair, the co-host of the show, today without my co-host. Jason Hamrock, CEO of Missional Marketing, who I usually record this podcast with, went on vacation right after we recorded the interview that we're going to be sharing with you today. And I didn't want to delay getting this podcast out to you, so just decided I'd record a quick intro myself. Today's interview is with someone that I've known of for years. His name is Jeff Keady. He's a pastor of a church in Iowa, and he's the co-host of a podcast called 200 Churches. And today, with Pastor Jeff, we do a deep dive into what it would look like for a pastor of a church to have his own podcast, not just simply pushing out the weekly sermon into a podcast platform, but actually creating content specifically and uniquely for a podcast. Jeff is very creative, has some great ideas, and I think that you're really going to benefit from listening to this interview. If you find yourself benefiting from this interview and the other content that we're creating in this podcast, we'd appreciate it if you leave us a rating or review wherever you're listening or wherever you're watching. That would mean a lot to us. Just help more people find our podcast as we continue to bring these interviews to you. And one last thing, if you haven't checked out our YouTube channel, we've been adding content on a pretty regular basis to help you leverage more digital tools to reach more people online, whether that's your website, social media, SEO, a lot of different things that you can learn by just simply tuning into our YouTube channel. Make sure that you subscribe to that so you get notified and ring the bell. I think that's what you're supposed to do. Subscribe and ring the bell so that you get notified when we are posting new content to our YouTube channel. Hopefully you will find that content just as helpful as you find this podcast. Well, again, thanks for taking the time to listen or watch or however you consume it. Here's our interview with Jeff Keady. Jeff Keady, welcome to the show today. We're so glad to have you.
Well, thank you, Bart. It's good to be here with you and Jason.
I've been looking forward to this for the last few weeks since I reached out to you and you agreed to come and join us on this podcast. It's kind of weird being on a Zoom call with you. You and I have Zoomed once before years ago, or Skype call. It might have been a Skype. I think it was pre-Zoom. It was actually a Skype call. That's how long ago it was. And you didn't remember me, which my feelings were not hurt.
I do remember. I just don't remember the exact conversation.
Okay. One of the things I remembered was that I was sitting at my kitchen table and I had kind of my dining room light over me and the wall behind me was brown. And you said, hey, if you're ever going to shoot video, that looks really good. You should shoot video right there. So I did. I started shooting video.
I do remember that. Yeah.
You remember that? Anyway, you have been a part of my weekly routine for probably 5 years. You are the co-host of 200 Churches podcast. And I invited you to come on the show today to talk about podcasts. That's what we're going to do. We're going to have a podcast about podcasts. So why don't we start today by just having you share a little bit of your story, talk about your ministry background, the church that you're serving in now, and any other details that you think might be valuable for our listeners.
Well, my ministry background actually goes all the way back to me being like 9 years old and looking at the pastor and seeing his soft leather Bible draped over his hand and the pages hanging down and hearing these things about God that I'd never heard before. And God speaking to me then and saying, that's what you're going to do. That's what I want you to do. And I remember sitting there saying, oh yeah, that's what God wants me to do. And so ever since like 9 years old, I've known I'm going to be a pastor. And, there's a few twists and turns, as a teenager and young adult, but I made it to Bible college at age 20 and never looked back. So I've been a pastor now for about 34 years and been in small churches as small as, I remember one Sunday morning we had 16 people. And that was I remember thinking, is this critical mass? I wasn't sure. The space would seat about 40. So 16 was pretty sparse. But from that to, the church that I'm in today, now after COVID, I don't, where are we? We had 300 and something on Sunday morning. But who knows where that's all going to go. And was in a church as a youth pastor, assistant pastor. The only thing I haven't done really is anything to do with vocals or music or instrumentals. I don't do that. But I was in a church from 94 to 04 for 10 years in Amsterdam, New York. Okay. And then I was 14 years in Orange City, Iowa. So in 24 years, I was only in 2 different churches, which was really nice. And then about 4 years ago, God brought us here to Newton, Iowa, where, Lord willing, I get to finish my time, which I hope I'm able to. I think it'll work.
Wow. That's amazing. Congratulations. Way to go, God, for leading you down this path. And how cool is that? At 9-year-old, I was not thinking, I don't think God was speaking to me at 9-year-old that, I don't think I was mature enough to understand that my calling to work in the church. I never thought I'd work in a church, but I found myself working in a church, but that was a different story.
Yeah, let's not go to maturity now. It's just, just that's still small voice. But my first church, though, this is a funny thing. My first church was in a little town in Pennsylvania called Factoryville, PA. So that's
only in
where
Pennsylvania.
It started.
Yeah, that sounds like a town in Pennsylvania.
It does.
Yeah. No, there were no factories in it when I was there.
Wow.
So if you got to figure that too.
Go figure.
Yeah.
So you've been. So today we want to talk about this podcast. You've been podcasting for what, 8 or so years. How did that get started?
First off, I went back to school, which was a great thing. After 23 years, I finally went back to get an MDiv. And when I did that, I met a guy. And after I met a guy, I got to know him and brought him to my church. And about the 3rd month we were in the church, he said to me, "Hey, you and I should have a podcast." Well, the truth is, he just liked to hear himself talk. And so he wanted to do a podcast. But I had been listening to Michael Hyatt's podcast. Michael Hyatt had started a podcast back then. And there were just a couple others, and podcasts weren't really known back in 2011, 2012, but I'd been listening. And so I kind of had an idea of what this stuff was about and what was required to do it, because Michael Hyatt, he explained everything as he was starting his. He was very transparent. So it was pretty interesting. And so one day in January of 2013, I said to Johnny off the cuff, I said, "Hey, you said we should do a podcast. Well, let's do one." He's like, "Okay." I said, "No, today. Let's do one today." He's like, "I can't do Johnny." Bart, you would know, his voice got really high. He's like, "Well, I don't know. Yeah, what are you talking about?" I'm like, "No, let's do it today." I said, "I've got this little voice recorder, and we'll do it." So I set it down on the desk between us. He sat on one side, I sat on the other, and I pushed record. And we sat there and looked at each other and we laughed, and we had no idea what we were doing, but we recorded 5 minutes and 43 seconds. And that was all we had. That was our first episode. It was, I think it was January 13th of 2013. And we literally just went from there. And within 8 days, we had a website. We had a podcast hosting deal. We were on iTunes within 8 days, and we had one episode, and there it was. And just little by little, we just went from there. But that's how it started.
Once you hit iTunes, you're legit, right?
Yeah.
There was a day and age when getting something onto iTunes was really, really cool. If you could get something into iTunes, it's not so complicated anymore. They've made it a lot easier for podcasters and content producers to get their stuff online and distributed in places like that. But that back then that would have been a big deal.
So what's been the focus of the podcast?
Yeah, it's interesting because when we started, we said, okay, what should the podcast be about? Who is it to? And all that. And I said, well, what if we did a podcast for small church pastors by small church pastors? And then Johnny added the phrase, "that doesn't suck." I'm like, okay, well, I'm kind of okay. This was almost 9 years ago, and I was a little uncomfortable with that, but I'm like, that's Johnny and that's his generation. So that's essentially what we did is we said there's 80+% of churches in America are small churches. In fact, around the world are small churches. And I had been through personally the 80s and 90s church growth, mega church conferences, all this stuff. And I was tired of being disillusioned by the results I would get when I come back from a conference and then try to do, in fact, 150 people left our church when we returned from Saddleback in the 90s, and on a dime changed things in our church. Now we got more than 150 people, after that, but still, there's a reason there's small churches.
Yeah.
There's a reason that 80% of churches in America are 100 people or less. And I don't think it's a bad reason. So anyway, I said to Johnny, listen, let's do it for small church pastors. And we looked online. We just did a Google search, not just podcasts, but any resources. And there were very few resources for small church ministry. Small church ministry was kind of, that was taboo. Everybody wants to grow. Everybody wants a big church. And most of the resources were there for growing your church. And we just decided we are not going to talk about church growth. We're going to talk about church health. So one of the things that I did is I said to Johnny, okay, I've been in the church now for 8 years. And this is what we've done out of our church of 175 to 200 people over the last 8 years. And we had literally dumped over, was it $1 million or $2 million? I'm not going to do the math now, but it was either $1 million or $2 million into missions in those 8 years. And I started thinking back to the families that we had ministered to over those 8 years. The funerals that we had sat with people through and helped people through, the hospital visits, the kids ministry that we did, how many students got to go out around the world on missions just from our little church of 200. And I said, when you take all the ministry of all these small churches, this is significant kingdom work. This isn't small fry type stuff.
No.
So our tagline has been from the beginning, ministry encouragement for pastors of small churches. It's just so straightforward and so clear. And it has really guided us the whole time. And we've thought about going in different directions and have on different episodes, just out of things that we were curious about and wanted to learn about. But really, ministry encouragement for pastors of small churches has been the focus. And that's been really helpful from the start.
Wow.
So Jeff, I was really intrigued by the podcast when, I first discovered it. And I'm pretty sure, I don't know if I was listening to it before you had the opportunity to be on the Carey Nieuwhof podcast, but as we were discussing earlier, episode 99 of the Carey Nieuwhof podcast, you and Johnny were guests, and that gave you exposure to, a lot of small church pastors. And I was one of them. I was actually pastoring in Canada. And so I had my ear to what Carey Nieuwhof was doing because he was obviously in Canada. And I just began to feed on the content that you guys were producing. And it was a real blessing for me and the other leaders that I was serving alongside in ministry. The reason that I was excited about having you on the podcast today is that as Jason and I meet with churches and pastors and communications leaders in churches, one of the things that we always talk about is creating content and then leveraging that content digitally to reach more people online. And 99% of what we talk about is leveraging sermon content, using the website, using social media. And I've recently had some conversations with some pastors who have talked about better ways of leveraging podcast to reach more people online, not just, publishing their weekly sermon as a podcast, but actually creating content that's specific for a podcast audience that might be evangelistically oriented or discipleship and equipping oriented, but just doing something where they can take their gifts and their talents and leverage that in a different medium to reach more people. And I started thinking about, that Jason and I have been doing this podcast for a year. I would say that we're novices and we're still learning and we're trying to figure out how to do this, but we're also not pastors. And I thought, Jeff Keady has been a pastor for all these years that he has been podcasting. And while your podcast has been for pastors, I wanted you to speak into just sort of the what it's taken for you to sustain a podcast over the years that you have while pastoring a church, and how you would speak or encourage some of these pastors who are thinking about doing that.
Yeah, well, it's interesting for me because we went for 6.5 years and never missed a week. And that was through all kinds of life experiences, kids getting married, parents dying, kids being born, church split. I mean, just you name it, the stuff that we went through. And we literally never missed a week in 6.5 years. And then one night I did what I never wanted to do, and I said I wouldn't do. I gave myself an out 1 week. And that's all that it took to throw me off the train tracks. And I've never really gotten back on now in the last 2 years. Now, we've continued to podcast, but it's not a consistent weekly thing. So your question was, I think, as you're pastoring, what does it take to podcast? I think it's like anything, whatever your priority is in life, you're just going to do it. We do what we want to do, and we make time for that. And for 6.5 years, I felt like one of the priorities in my life was speaking to pastors and keeping that podcast going, because there weren't other podcasts like it. Johnny and I grew tons through that process, through the journey, through the consistency, through all of the different guests that we talked to, through the relationships that we built. And I'm thankful that at that time in the podcasting evolution, we got in when we did, because we got to know so many people, from people like Carrie Newhoff to one of our favorites has been N.T. Wright. We've talked to him several times. And then we talked about Dan Reiland from 12 Stone in the Atlanta area. And he was so gracious. The very first year in 2013, I direct messaged him on Twitter. And I said, we've got this podcast for small church pastors. You've been equipping. You were the pastor's coach. Back in the 90s, I used to get your weekly email called The Pastor's Coach from Dan Reiland. And I used to look forward to that email. And I read it every week. And I told him that. I said, hey, would you come on our podcast? Well, he did. And we did a 5-part series on his book, Amplified Leadership. And then after that, he was on another, I think he's been on 26 or 27 times on our podcast. And I went down to one of the Rethink conferences, I think it was 2 years ago, and he and I got together and were able to visit together, because the Rethink was right at the church where his office is, the 12 Stone location, and got to see him. And then a few other friends that I'd been connected with all the way back to the Maximum Impact simulcast days of John Maxwell and some of the ministry consultants that we used back then. So, these kinds of relationships are so important. But I've gotten a little bit off track of your question. If I haven't answered it yet, refocus me and I'll land on it.
Well, I guess one of the things that, you talked about was making the commitment to do it and sticking with it, right? That's, I think, step number one. And I will highlight, we were on a call last week with some of our leadership team at Missional Marketing, and I mentioned that we were coming up on episode number 50. I think this episode we're recording now, I think, is number 48. And I told some of our business partners that we were going to hit number 50 and we were going to call that season 1 and take a little break. And then the reason is that, how many episodes did you and Johnny have in season 1?
350.
Yeah.
And
I don't think we should do that.
No, it's hard. I mean, we've been doing this for, I would say, we're about 58 or 59 weeks in, and we're about, we're a few weeks shy of that 52 episodes and being a year's worth, because we've been trying to do one a week. And it is difficult, right? It is difficult to line up guests. It's difficult to have the content. It's difficult to find it on our schedules, because, I wish I could say I podcasted for a living, but I don't. This is part of what we do. We've committed to doing it. So why don't you speak into some of the other pitfalls or some of the challenges that you and Johnny have faced over the years as you've tried to maintain the consistency, as well as maybe some of the best practices or things that you've learned along the way.
Yeah. I looked at that question that you sent me about pitfalls, and I thought, when we were podcasting regularly, I don't know any pitfalls. There were really no downsides for us. I remember the week that my 21-year-old son was in a terrible automobile accident, and he was in the ICU in a coma with a traumatic brain injury. And I sat in the little patient consultant room, which was like 4x4. And I closed the door and I literally recorded a 10-minute episode, right straight into my laptop. And I uploaded it. I think it's right after episode 92. It's between 92 and 93. And I didn't even give it a number. I just said something like special episode. And I just shared with our listeners where I was at and what was going on in my life. But also, I wanted to get an episode out that week. And I did. So I don't know that there were any pitfalls to regularly doing it, but there were a ton of advantages and benefits. But going to local church ministry. So when Johnny and I podcasted together, we were in the same church together. And then when we separated and went into different churches, we still went for like a year and a half and continued to podcast regularly. And one of the things that I think pastors can do, we podcasted 2 pastors, but in a local church, podcasting is a great solution in the area of discipleship. So if you've got a weekly message, your sermon, and it goes out every week, personally, I don't call that a podcast. That ain't a podcast. That's a sermon recording that goes out every week. Okay. But it's podcasting, it's the medium. So that's what they call it. But a pastor could sit down at his or her desk once a week and speak for 15 minutes on either on the message they're going to bring on the coming weekend, or the message they just brought, or both. They could speak on Monday and unpack and augment the message they just gave the day before, and give some reminders of action steps and further study or further reflection. Hey, yesterday morning we talked about this. I've had a day to think about it, and I've talked to some of you about it. And here are some other things that you might think about. Here are some other passages you might look at. Here are some action steps that you could take this week. And then on a Thursday or a Friday, whenever you take your day off, hey, this weekend, we're going to be talking about this. This is the passage. And you can actually begin the message ahead of time, and it only needs to be 2-3 minutes. I mean, it doesn't have to be long. But if you set it up as a podcast, people can get it in their podcast feed right where they get all their other podcasts. And as long as you're consistent, people will start listening. I mean, there has to be some value to it as well, but we're pastors, right? It's what we want to share. If we're sharing God's word, we're sharing value. So another thought is I know some pastors who have done a podcast about different businesses in their community and the people running those businesses and how they got started. And it's literally the pastor going from business to business, and they come up with some catchy name that's connected to the name of the town. And it's just for local consumption. They're not trying to go viral, and they're not trying to get, all these listeners, but it's for their community. And people are like, hey, Sam's on the podcast this weekend where, he does carpet cleaning, and he's on, hey, did you ever know that, he was married 4 times, or like whatever the story is, interesting stuff. That's a great way for evangelism and getting your church out there, being seen as a normal person. And it's not all religious talk, but you're actually talking about your community. You're being affirming, and you're building people up, you're building businesses up, and you're really creating a lot of goodwill for yourself in the community. And that's all pre-evangelistic type stuff. So you could use a podcast for that. So you could use it in the community to meet community needs, but you could also use it within your church. We have a podcast. It's called our church's Community Heights Alliance Church. And so the people in our church refer to our church as CHAC. I don't like CHAC because it's not a word. It's confusing to people, but we call the podcast the CHAC Insider, which is probably the worst name for a podcast because you don't want to be insider focused. But I thought, hey, that would get people, they want to be on the inside. Maybe they'll listen. So when I first came to the church, I started recording with different couples and individuals in the church, just telling their story. And I did that for the first year. And then some things blew up in the church that I had to take care of, and we kind of got off track. And I've gotten back to it a little bit, but not consistently. But that's another way to get people to know the people in your church. They see them on Sunday mornings, but they have no idea their story. And I remember sitting down with one couple, and I found out that they lost a son who was, I don't remember, it was 4 or 5 years old. And then their other son, they had an accident or an illness. But anyway, they had been through tremendous suffering. Wow. And then another couple that we sat down, and they said, well, yeah, last year our marriage almost ended. And here's what happened. Like, I had no idea. And so people in the church were able to hear each other's stories. There's endless possibilities for you as a local church pastor to use the medium of podcasting and the consistency of podcasting and the whole deal where it just downloads on your people's phones, right? It's so easy. So your imagination is the limit on that.
Hi, Bart Blair here. I'm the producer of Missional Marketing's Church Growth Interviews podcast. On behalf of our entire team, we really appreciate you tuning in. Let me ask you a question. If you're a church leader or a church communications professional, do you know how Google sees your church website? In other words, if people in your community were to Google churches near me or best church in my city or good church nearby, do you know where your church website would show up in those search results? At the top maybe, or somewhere in the middle, or somewhere on page 4? You know, there's a common misunderstanding that if we simply build a great website and we launch it, that Google will somehow work its magic and people will find us online. But there's a bit more art and science to making sure that your church website shows up in the top of those search results. And that science is called local SEO, or local search engine optimization. And at Missional Marketing, local SEO is one of the core services that we provide for churches all across the United States and Canada. And we'd love to help you. If you'd like to learn more, click to our website at missionalmarketing.com and follow the link at the top of the page that says Church SEO. You can request a free local SEO report to see how your church is showing up in Google these days, and you can schedule an appointment to talk with Jason or with me or with one of our other digital strategists to help you decide whether or not a local SEO boost is right for your church. Hey, again, we appreciate you tuning into our podcast, and we look forward to the opportunity to serving you in your church and reaching more people for Jesus. Now, back to the show.
So I think sometimes we like when we did our podcast, probably when you did your podcast. Well, I really appreciate your podcast, literally how it got started. You just hit record and started talking, and I think we have this concept where, if we're not like the Carey Nieuwhofs of the world, why would we even want to start? I think your advice, I think this is what you're saying, is just get started. Technology is so far advanced. You can do Zoom, right? You can do anything, and it's really professional. But just get started and let God lead you where He may want to take you with this thing.
100%, and that's true with so much in life. And I heard a guy say one time, well, whenever you start something, it's always bad. And it is, whenever you start something, you're not very good at it. And I literally told Johnny, I said, listen, let's just get started and let's get the bad out of the way and let's get to the good. And I believe that it would take 6 months before we would have like any listeners at all. And it was longer than that in some ways and shorter in other ways. When we'd have 20 downloads a week, we'd be like, woohoo, we've got like 3 downloads every day. We've got 3 downloads, and then it got to where, I can't even remember the numbers. I mean, it got to where it was 20,000 a week there for a while. And you just kind of lose track of, how many that is, but that's just 2 schmucks in a church in a small town of like 5,000 people in the Midwest. It's just what it was, but we were consistent. We did it every week, and we built relationships. Yeah, I think that's another side benefit, is all the relationship building you get to do. And that's the church, right? It's like knowing people. That's right. Like I'm really impressed with your focus on just having
couples in your church, just kind of talk to them and again, just hear their story, because that's what, bigger churches will do that. And that's what they'll show on the screen as like somebody's testimonial thing. Well,
yeah,
you can do that in a podcast and it's just as effective. Yet
it's
way simpler. Yeah.
Yes,
exactly. Yeah.
Man, so that's good stuff.
It was something that what you're saying there reminds me. I'm pretty sure that it's John Maxwell that said this. And if it's not John Maxwell, we'll give him the credit for it anyway. But it's that content compounds. And he would know. If anybody would know, it's John Maxwell. It's just that there is something about continuously creating content with the purpose of adding value, not to just hear your own voice or to spout and shout what you know, but to try to add value. And I think that there's something critically valuable about that, especially as it relates to our ability to communicate gospel-centric conversations, right? Whether it's interviews with people about their lives and the way that God has impacted their lives, or as you use the term sort of pre-evangelism, about being engaged in our community and highlighting people in the community that others might not know, and just telling stories, right? I think there's a lot of power in that. Consistency is obviously the key. We managed to preach 52 sermons a year, and and they're not always good, right? In fact,
absolutely.
Talk about when you're starting out. I have gone back and watched or listened to some of my earliest sermons on a rare occasion and think, oh my gosh, I am so grateful that God let me grow out of that. I'm better today than I was when I first started. I just think that's really, I love your creativity and your thoughts on that. Jason, what did you have another question that you wanted to ask there?
Yeah. So, I think, if I had to summarize this, it's about just having consistency, just starting and having consistency, and you'll figure it out. And through that, you build a lot of relationships. And I think God teaches you a lot. What else can pastors learn about podcasting?
I think if you have new conversations with new people and you force yourself, like you said, Bart, about the 52 messages every week, every month, 52 every year. You need to have new ideas, new thoughts, new conversations, new relationships. And podcasting helps all of those things, even if they're just local relationships, even if they're just sitting down and having a long form discussion with each of your elders or all of your deacons or whatever the leadership structure is in your church, all of your ministry leaders, and allowing them to tell their story. We know this as we stand in our platforms every weekend, we look out and really everybody has a story, right? Everybody does. And it always surprises me, but it always is so special to me when I hear these stories. This 92-year-old guy who said to me, when my sister got married, I was the one to drive her and her husband from the wedding to, I don't know, it was to the reception or to their honeymoon location or wherever. And this was back when they would steal the bride and groom away after the wedding, and they would keep them apart that first night. Their friends would get together, and there's a term for it. So he gets his sister and brand new brother-in-law, and he's driving away, and they're coming after them. So he's kind of speeding a little bit, and he goes around a corner, and he gets in an accident, and his brother-in-law is killed. And I said, John, your sister just got married, and her husband is now dead? He's like, yeah. I'm like, holy cow. What kind of a story is that? That's just one thing that this guy's had to deal with in his 92 years. And you hear story after story. So when you sit down and you talk, and Carey Nieuwhof calls them long form conversations, right? I love listening to them. And you get your people to tell their stories. When you're just in a room with you and them, they'll talk and they'll forget the microphone is in front of them. And then, you get their permission, obviously, before and even after. Is there anything you want to cut out? Is there anything? No, if it can help somebody else, you go ahead and share it. And people get to know each other, because you'd have to go to a coffee shop and sit down with somebody to actually have those kinds of conversations. But now everybody can go out on their walk or mow their, or whatever it is, and they can listen to that in 1 week. And now everybody else in the church who takes the time to listen will have that intimacy with those people and will understand their life a little better.
And God is in every story. And so
yes,
that's gonna pop out, right? I can imagine this 92-year-old man. Wow, what a tragedy that he had to go through. But I'm sure God did something there and made that to his glory at some point. And you just wonder, like, oh, what I would want to hear that story, because I could apply that to my life and things that I might be able to take with me. So you're not only blessing that individual, you're blessing so many people by hearing that story, which that's amazing. Like right there, that's why you should do a podcast, pastors.
Right. And we spent all this time on a Sunday morning. I mean, up until a year and a half ago, a lot of pastors didn't even record their messages, and if they were just set somewhere.
Yeah.
We spend all that time to give a talk to a group of people. Put a microphone in front of yourself and record. And if you're consistent and you give quality, and there's maybe a little something unexpected every once in a while, people will listen to it. It just takes time. So you just have to be consistent, but you have to believe in it, otherwise you're not going to take the time to do it.
Wow.
Go ahead. I was going to say, I've had a bit of it's been a pet peeve of mine, I guess, for many years, is when a pastor stands up to begin his sermon and he'll say, last week we talked about this from 1 Corinthians chapter 2. And I'm thinking, no, we didn't talk about that. You talked about that. We sat here and listened to you.
It's the royal we.
Right. The royal we, exactly. And as you were, sharing that story there, Jeff, all I could think about is, my picture of the early church would be one in which there was probably a lot more conversation and a lot more dialogue than what we do today. And even though I wouldn't say that, a one-on-one or two-on-one podcast interview necessarily reflects the early church, it does give you an opportunity to have conversation about things that you don't necessarily have the opportunity to in a regular weekly church service, because that's just not typically the way we think about structuring our worship service on Sundays in dialogue. But a podcast gives you that opportunity to literally say, we are talking about this and we talked about that, right? Bringing others into the conversation.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. And, Pastor, maybe you or whoever's listening, maybe you're not a communicator like that. Maybe you don't like that kind of chit chat or that kind of conversational approach. There's somebody in your church who does, and they have no idea that it could actually be a ministry, that their gift of gab, so to speak, could actually be a ministry in your church. Maybe you need to grab somebody and say, hey, let's do an experiment. Let's do a month of conversations with our people. We'll just pick out 4 and we'll do one every week. And let's just do an experiment and see how it goes, and promote it and talk about it and just see what happens. Yeah. And maybe you find somebody who will do that, and it'd be really nice to find somebody who would also edit it and upload it for you, because that's where the time comes in.
Yeah. There's always that. Yeah.
Yeah. Why don't you speak to that from a technical aspect a little bit, because that's obviously something that you and Johnny had to kind of learn on the fly. It's changed a bit over the years, I'm sure, but from a technical standpoint, how, again, did you manage that as a small church pastor?
A lack of sleep, actually. It would take me about 5 hours a week to record and then do all the editing, produce the episode and then upload it to where it needed to be uploaded to, and then get it promoted out on whatever social media stuff. I could start at, say, 7 or 8 o'clock at night and kind of take my time and take a break if I needed to or whatever. And I might not be done until 2 a.m. And that was kind of a weekly commitment that I made. But you have to edit it, and the better you edit it, the better product you put out. And there are a lot of podcasts right now that are they just press record and you just hear all the, you hear all of those. And that's just a philosophy. People say, well, they like to hear the conversation, and those are in everybody's conversation. And that's fine. I didn't do that because I had guests with varying degrees of on-air talent. And so there were some people that were pretty big names and really good, but they had a ton of verbal clutter. And I had to sweep all that out of the way. And when you swept it out of the way, you had a much more engaging, listenable conversation afterwards. So I spent probably too much time editing. I spend not as much time now, but I still will go in because I want my guests to sound good. I don't want people to hear all this verbal clutter. I'll leave some in so it's a natural conversation, but a lot of it, and especially the longer pauses and pieces of verbal clutter, I'll take out. But yeah, it was a commitment, and there's no glory in it. But I tell you what, when I would be done and I would produce it and it would go out to a couple thousand pastors, and I knew that, others would be listening. It'd be like a painter when he finishes the painting, or a composer when they finish the piece of work or whatever. It was always like a work of art that I just finished and I put out that people were going to enjoy. And that was so few things in my life have been so fulfilling as 1 or 2 in the morning, getting up from the dining room table and going to bed and feeling that sense of accomplishment. Yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah. So talk to us a little about what your pod, so our listeners can tune in and talk about your podcast and where they can find it. What's it called? And
yeah, 200 churches, 200 churches, all one word. You could just search that, and you'll find that on any podcast. If you go to 200churches.com and go to the podcast series tab, you can click on different individuals, or I think we've got my favorite is the college professor one, and I forget, what do I call that? Scholar one or something. But if you're a seminary prof, I think it's called the seminary series. If you're a seminary prof, you're listed in there somewhere. We've had a lot of seminary professors, scholars, authors, and they would all be in there. But we've got, I don't know, some around 360 or 70 episodes in there. And there's just a ton of encouragement. It's really encouragement is what it is. A little instruction, some good ideas, inspiration, but just a lot of encouragement.
Oh, fantastic.
I do want to point out one thing, because I know that this has been pretty important for you in your life, but you made some pretty significant health changes for yourself in the last number of years and have been helping other pastors and church leaders as well. Why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Well, that's got its ups and its downs. My dad always said he used to work as an elevator guy, and he said the job had its ups and downs. Well, when you're helping people get healthy and lose weight, that has its ups and downs too. So 3 years ago, I started, and I lost 80 pounds and was feeling fantastic. Wow. And then we had 2020, and it really isn't the fault of 2020. It's just me and my wiring and how I'm wired. But I've managed to help other people lose 80 pounds who have kept it off, and I have put almost all of it back on. And you put the first part of it on kind of unknowingly. You really don't know what's going on. You're just caught up in the culture, the food culture we live in. But then when you do it the second time in broad daylight, you kind of know what you're doing, and it's still, you're still not able to help yourself. So I'm still working with some people, and yet when you're not doing it yourself, it's really hard to try to encourage or tell somebody else, what to do. However, the plan that I was working on was very effective, very helpful. It still would be, but it's food. If anybody struggles with food or food addiction, they would understand. You're only a food addict if you eat addictive foods. That's the truth. I suppose you're only a drug addict if you take addictive drugs, right? So if you can get off of those addicted foods, but the problem is in our society, they are everywhere. There's a dealer about on every corner. You don't even have to get out of your car. You just drive through and you just pop your phone on the little thing and they give you out your, what I call your dime bag. You know, you could drive away. And I mean, it literally really is that. And so I'm kind of making light of it, but my heart really goes out to people who struggle. And if you're listening today and you're saying, wow, that's me, you know, I struggle. So I've got a guy that I work with, and he's also at, if you go to coachingforpastors.org, he and I both have kind of a presence there, and he's doing better than I am. He's doing pretty well. He also lost 80 pounds. Wow. And you can check in there. So go to coachingforpastors.org. It's a podcast that I started recently. Don't have a lot of episodes up on there yet, although there's several and they're really good ones. But there's also a kind of a health coaching side to that. And if you're interested, you can go there. And again, my own sister lost 80 pounds and has kept it off. And I've told her, I've said, hey, don't cheat.
Yeah.
Do not cheat. Just stay on the straight and narrow, and you'll be okay. Because when you eat the wrong foods, it just fuels your cravings for other wrong foods. And one of the interesting things I've learned that I didn't know, some people are affected very differently than other people by the same foods. So to some people, processed sugars and flours are highly addictive. To other people, they're hardly addictive at all. They can eat some and stop, and others, kind of like alcohol, they can't just take one drink, and then other people can just have a drink and be done with it. Yeah. With food, it's the same way, and it's really interesting. Unfortunately, I happen to be on the more addictive end of that, and so I have to be really careful with what I eat. And for the past 6 to 8 months, I haven't been careful enough. So there you go. There's the story. That's the skinny on it.
There's the skinny. Thanks for your transparency and your honesty. Yeah. You look good though. Your face is bright and shiny. And
shucks.
I no special effects, no filters. Yeah, you look good.
No filters.
You look good. You sound good. And well, you know what? I just want to say again, I really appreciate you taking the time with us. I respect what you've done and the ministry that you and Johnny have had. And, as a pastor, I can't overstate just the influence that you've had. I've on several occasions reached out to people like Dave Jacobs, who has been a long time, friend of yours and part of the podcast. And I've built a relationship with him, as well as some other people that I would have never even probably known about if it hadn't been for the podcast that you guys are doing. So really appreciate it. And again, thanks for taking the time with us today.
Yeah. Well, that's the blessing. That's the blessing of doing a podcast like that. And Bart, I'll put a bow on it by saying, stay curious, stay humble, and keep learning. When I went back to school for my master's degree in 2010, it was absolutely life-changing to me. What I learned and the people that I got to meet, it was absolutely life-changing. So if I could encourage anybody, just keep learning, keep growing, new conversations, new ideas, new people, and never stop.
Well said.
So it's been great to be with you guys. Good to get to know you, Jason and Bart, to make our acquaintance yet again. It's awesome. And thanks for what you guys are doing.